Good evening and welcome to this presentation of my new book on HMS Ambuscade from 1746 to the present day. This evening I'm going to take you through a short guide to the book and talk a bit about the ships that served the Royal Navy during that period. So let's start with an introduction. Ambuscade comes from the French word embuscade, which means an ambush. There were 5 what I call substantive ambuscades, and pictures are on the right-hand part of the screen. There were, in addition to those 5, 3 short-lived Napoleonic prizes. A prize is essentially a ship captured from an enemy at time of war, and they were briefly renamed HMS Ambuscade, but didn't play a major role in the Royal Navy. We almost had another one in the 19th century. The first steam-powered frigate was initially to be named HMS Ambuscade, but then got renamed before it was launched HMS Amphion. There was actually an earlier, I discovered, wasn't aware of this initially, but there was another ambuscade, a fighting ship, but not part of the Royal Navy. It was a privateer in the 1710s. Privateer essentially is a ship that operates under a letter of marque and authorization from the British government to attack enemy ships. The key point about ambuscades is that they were frigates and destroyers. In the words of Admiral Lord Nelson, they were the eyes of the fleet, and I'll be emphasising their role. It's not a very well-known ship's name, but that's because they were the workhorses rather than the ships of the line or the battleships of the more modern period. So let's talk about the first HMS Ambuscade, which was a French frigate. It was built in Le Havre in 1745. It was a large frigate for its time, 132 feet long, and quite heavily armed as well for the period. It was captured in the Channel in 1746 by HMS Defiance, and was brought into Royal Navy service. But in addition to that, the design was actually copied by the Royal Navy, and other frigates were based on it. This may come as a bit of a surprise to many people, given Britain's dominance of the seas during this period, but actually the French ship designs were deemed to be better, and we often copied them. Probably whisper that. So it was commissioned in 1746. It fought in the War of Spanish Succession and the 7 Years' War. Its first captain was Lucius O'Brien, who was probably famous, particularly folk in Scotland may or may not want to know this, but he actually played a very important role in thwarting the Jacobite rebellion. He intercepted a French ship bringing gold, gunpowder and weapons to the Jacobite army just before Culloden, and that weakened the army considerably. As far as Ambuscade is concerned, it took part in 2 of the biggest naval battles of the period, Cape Finisterre in May 1747 and the Battle of Lagos in August 1759. Frigates were not heavily engaged in these types of battles. These are battles that were fought by what were known as ships of the line, big gun ships up to 100 guns, whereas Ambuscade was obviously smaller than that. Its job was to scout, to pass signals on, etc. The real work of a frigate during this period was to capture privateers, which Ambuscade did in all parts of the world, that the Royal Navy fought in, and also did convoy protection. So in 1762, it was coming to the end of its life as a Royal Navy warship, and it was sold as a privateer and took part in an operation, a private operation essentially, to raid the Spanish port of La Plata in South America. It went very badly wrong, both for the ships and the officers, because we went to war, and therefore letter of marque didn't apply. So that was the first one. Let's move on to the second Ambuscade, which was the first British-built one in Deptford in 1773. It was what's known as a 32-gun frigate. Those who can add up among you will quickly work out that it actually had 38 guns, but this is because carronades were not counted as part of the classification system. Carronades were short-barreled guns made in Falkirk, which could be devastating at short range, particularly when closing with the enemy with an aim to board them. Ambuscade fought in the American Revolutionary War, again countering privateers up and down the American west coast, East Coast, and it fought in home waters, often forgotten that the American Revolutionary War, or War of Independence as we often call it, was fought not just in America but in home waters, and that's where against the Americans' allies, the French and the Spanish. Ambuscade captured a French warship, the Helene. It also took part in the relief of Guernsey, which was a British privateer base, and the relief the siege of Gibraltar in 1781, when the Spanish were attempting to take back the Rock. Peacetime, it was essentially laid off, and the officers and the crew went on half pay, but was back in service very quickly in the Revolutionary and the Napoleonic Wars, the major conflict of the period. It fought in the West Indies and in the Channel, where it captured 2 prizes. Unfortunately, it then got captured by the French frigate Bayonnaise in 1798, which was a very rare thing to happen for a French warship in the Napoleonic Wars to capture a British one. But there were extenuating circumstances, not least that the French frigate was bringing a garrison of troops back from the West Indies, and therefore had lots of extra soldiers on board to help the boarding action. And also the Ambuscades officers were killed early on by essentially a lucky shot. So the subsequent court of inquiry found no blame on the crew or the officers, those that survived. So Ambuscade became Ambuscade again in French service, but was recaptured in 1803 by probably one of the most famous warships of the period. HMS Victory became famous because it was Nelson's flagship at the Battle of Trafalgar. And you can actually see the Victory today. It's probably the main exhibit at the wonderful Portsmouth Naval Museum. So Ambuscade served in all theatres, latterly in the Mediterranean, but it took part in a number of undercover operations of the sort that in the Second World War would have been done by the Special Operations Executive. We don't know a lot about them, but I've included in the book what I could discover from the archives in relation to the operations that took place. They were certainly highly regarded, as was the captain of the period. Napoleon famously said, wherever you will find a fathom of water, there you will find the British. This was Britain's great strength, having ships like frigates that could sail and land troops and take actions anywhere on the long Napoleonic coastline. So Napoleon had a great regard, didn't quite understand navies and fleets, had to be said, but nonetheless a high regard for the ability of the Royal Navy to project power all over the continent and the world. The ship obviously had a pretty tough war and was eventually broken up in 1810 when it wasn't fit for service any longer. So as I explained earlier, there was a bit of a gap because it was to be a steam power frigate in the 19th century, but lordships decided to change the name. So the next ambuscade was essentially the World War I ambuscade, which was an Acasta-class destroyer built at John Brown's in 1913, 3 4-inch guns. The big change, of course, was that this was a fleet destroyer, did take part in fleet actions, and it could do that because it had torpedoes. And this meant that you could legitimately attack large capital ships like battleships and cruisers. They weren't actually very successful in doing that, but that was the theory. So at the start of the war, Ambuscade was with the 4th Destroyer Flotilla, to give you some idea of scale of the Royal Navy at this time. A flotilla included 20 destroyers, which is more than half the current Royal Navy. So it was in the Grand Fleet, which was based at Scapa, but Ambuscade fought at quite a famous action off the coast of Scarborough, where German ships shelled shelled the coast and that particular holiday resort. Ambuscade got involved in a collision. It may seem that this was a rather common occurrence, but actually Ambuscade was no more likely to get involved in collisions and repairs than any other ship in the Royal Navy. Its next action was the main fleet action of World War I, the Battle of Jutland, where Ambuscade did manage to help sink the German cruiser Rostock, one of two, possibly three destroyers that managed to get hits off with its torpedoes. It then moved on to transfer to the 6th Destroyer Flotilla and worked in what's called the Dover Patrol. If you think about it, Britain essentially was fighting mostly in northern France and the Western Front, and therefore supplies from Britain to France was absolutely key. And the Germans, based in Belgian ports like Antwerp, made a great effort to intercept those convoys, and it wasn't a hard barrage. It was a mixture of minefields and ships and of all sizes that attempted to protect very successfully, as it turns out, the convoy routes. Then rejoined the 4th Flotilla in 1917 in Portsmouth, where it was involved in convoy work, essentially protecting the merchant ships sailing around the coast of the UK. And also on sort of anti-submarine work. The U-boat threat was very serious towards the end of World War I, and whilst Ambuscade, we don't think actually sank any submarines, certainly attacked a couple. And again, there are details in the book and from the logbooks that I've been through. It ended the war in Dundee, technically in being repainted in Kirkcaldy Bay as part of the Northern Patrol Force. And was decommissioned and scrapped after the war, like so many other ships. So after the end of the First World War, the Navy reduced, but then started to modernise again, and part of that was HMS Ambuscade, which was a modified W-class destroyer. It was a prototype, so there were only two of them, Ambuscade and Amazon. And the idea was to test out new ideas and designs, which meant that because of the nature of the sort of prototype design features, they weren't necessarily hugely successful designs, but they led the way for more appropriate and better designs later on in the war. So it was launched in 1926, again on the Clyde at Yarrows, 4.7-inch guns. Again, torpedoes were still important at this time, and also increasing use of anti-aircraft guns. The Royal Navy rather underestimated the impact of air power on the Royal Navy, and during the war they were beefed up with a 3-inch AA gun, a couple more 20mm guns, and also anti-submarine kit was strengthened, that being a key role again in the Second World War. Before the war and peacetime visits, I cover those in the book. They went to South America on essentially a sales tour to fly the flag and to sell the design to South American navies. It went to the Falklands, which is something obviously we will hear more about, and also served in the Mediterranean. So yeah, it gives you, I hope the book gives you a flavour of what a peacetime warship did in the 20s and the 30s. Its war service in World War II, it was being refitted at the start, but it got involved in the evacuation from France, not at Dunkirk, but at Saint-Valery, where it helped evacuate elements of the 51st Highland Division, appropriate. The Scottish ship should be evacuating Scottish soldiers. Quite a controversial incident in relation to the 51st Highland Division, but nonetheless, Ambuscade played its part in what was a very difficult evacuation off a challenging beach, as some of the photographs in the book will demonstrate to you. It then went to Iceland and took part in convoy escort duties. This was the first leg of what were known as the Arctic convoys, where Britain was sending supplies, guns, ammunitions, and much beside to the Soviet Union when it was attacked by Hitler in 1941. Convoy duty was pretty tough in those waters, as you might imagine, and Ambuscade was pretty battered after that experience, and was sent on as a trial ship, essentially testing new anti-submarine warfare weapons. And it was finally scrapped here, that's where I live, in Troon in 1946. There were foreign orders, Portuguese Navy, and some went on to South American navies, but it would be fair to say the design had limited success, but it did help to develop these later models, which were successful. And finally, to today's Ambuscade, which is a Type 21 frigate. It was launched again at Yarrows in 1973, pennant number F172. It's a class of 8 ships with a very streamlined design. You can see in the picture here. Rakish is often the description that's put there. It was called the Greyhound of the fleet. Some called it the Porsche of the fleet. But you can see it had a very attractive design. Well armed with a very fast firing 4.5-inch gun. Still keeping some anti-aircraft guns, but first to have surface-to-air missiles, the Seacat initially, and also it had anti-missile technology in the form of 3-inch chaps, essentially aluminium strips fired to essentially divert missiles attacking the ship. Also, the first Ambuscade to have a helicopter, in this case the Westland Wasp initially. And then probably a key feature and a very unusual feature was the development of computer-assisted action information system, lots and other high tech for the time, and actually it was pretty impressive by the time. Those of you who had a computer in the late 70s, early 80s will know how basic they were, but this system was very sophisticated for its time. There were later upgrades. Ambuscade and all the rest of the class got XSS Ambuscade a little later after the Falklands War. And anti-submarine warfare torpedoes were added. Originally, it was thought not necessary because of the helicopters. Then they realised that helicopters can't always fly given the weather. And the helicopter itself was changed to a newer design, the Westland Lynx. Ambuscade served in the NATO Atlantic forces, in the guard ship in the West Indies and in the Persian Gulf during a period what's known later as the Tanker War, a conflict between Iraq and Iran. The Falklands War is probably what the HMS Ambuscade was most famous for. Its captain at the time was Peter Moss, who was very kindly playing a role with the charity that's seeking to bring the ship back to the Clyde. I'll talk about that in a minute. Ambuscade was actually on a resupply trip to Gibraltar when it was diverted to the Falklands. It had a pretty difficult journey down, an engine breakdown after ascension, and some skillful work by the crew to even get it to the total exclusion zone, which was an area around the Falklands that the British government had told ships to keep out of. Its main role initially was the anti-submarine warfare screen. The Argentine Navy had submarines, which were obviously a threat to all the ships, particularly the larger ships of the aircraft carriers and the supply ships that were the main part of the task force. It took part in a rather famous or infamous event on 25th of May, when the Exocet missiles were fired from Argentinian aircraft. We think probably aiming at HMS Hermes, the aircraft carrier. Ambuscade spotted it early on because the planes had to come into radar contact to fire their missiles. And they diverted the missile from them and essentially from Hermes, but the missile then re-locked on to the Atlantic conveyor, hit it, and eventually the ship was sunk. The Atlantic conveyor was carrying supplies, helicopters, and other military equipment for the task force. Its main role later in the conflict was naval gunfire. Essentially fired hundreds of shells into Argentinian positions, particularly those near Port Stanley, and helped secure the final assault on the Falklands Islands capital, which liberated the islands from the Argentinian army and Marines. After Port Stanley was recaptured, it took Marines to re-garrison South Georgia. After the war, it took part again in the Persian Gulf and what's known as the Armada Patrol, back to the West Indies. It also had another collision, or infamous one, which there are many pictures when it collided with the USS Dale, an American cruiser. It also went back to the Falklands twice, in fact, as part of cruises. And that takes us to the last stage of the story. It's still HMS Ambuscade, but which was still in service with the Royal Navy when discussions started between the Pakistan and British governments over the possibility of Britain building new Type 21 frigates for the Pakistan Navy. Those broke down on a variety of political and cost issues, but the discussions were reopened in 1992. When the Pakistan Navy needed to replace 8 US frigates, which were essentially leased to them, and Congress were refusing to extend the lease because of Pakistan's nuclear deterrent. So in 1993, agreement was reached to purchase the remaining Type 21s after those that were lost in the Falklands. And Ambuscade was one of those. And it was recommissioned as PNS Tariq in July 1993. Its first captain, who did that commissioning, was Captain Mohammed Anwar, who again is very kindly helping us with the repatriation and serves as a trustee to the charity. Tariq was the flagship ship of the frigate squadron. It had deployments in the normal Pakistan naval operating areas of the Gulf of Aden, Gulf of Oman, Persian Gulf, Arabian Sea, and took part in NATO exercises in the Mediterranean. In the Maldives, it famously rescued 377 tourists in an incident there, and was finally decommissioned in 2023. And it was then that the Pakistan Navy kindly agreed to donate the ship to the Clyde Naval Charity, which I'll touch on now. So in conclusion, HMS Ambuscades essentially were the workhorses of the fleet throughout the 3 centuries of their operation. They scouted, they were escorts, they took part in economic warfare. They were the strategically vital part of the Royal Navy. The big ships, the ships of the line, the battleships, they tend to be the fleet in being, the threat, if you like. It's the frigates and destroyers that get out and do the aggressive work right across the world that enabled the Royal Navy to project power in times of war. It had a very illustrious list of captains and crew. We know more about captains, sadly, than we know about crew. It's true for all military history, I'm afraid. But nonetheless, many of our captains went on to reach flag rank and achieve other things, both politically and militarily. And again, they're all covered in the book, and their stories are told. So people might have started off as the captain of quite a small ship like Ambuscade, but went on to other things. So as I said, the ship was donated to Clyde Naval Heritage. It's still actually out in Karachi at the moment. The plan is to bring it back to the Clyde as part of a museum that will focus on the Falklands War. Obviously, as I speak, there are a few challenges in bringing it back, in that we have a conflict in the Middle East and ships are being attacked and diverted away from the Suez Canal, which is the only practical route to get it home. So hopefully that will be resolved and we can raise the money needed to bring the ship back and create what I think will be a wonderful resource and museum ship, not just for naval historians, but also as a memorial to Clyde shipbuilding and the communities that developed it on the Clyde. So if you'd like to buy the book, you can get it through your local bookshop. We would ask if you're going to buy it online, to buy it direct from the publisher. Obviously, more of the proceeds go to the charity. The publisher and myself as the author are taking no fees for doing this book, but obviously there are costs, and they are less if you buy them direct. If you want to learn more about the bringing the ship back to the Clyde, the website address is there, clydenaval.co.uk. So thank you very much for listening. I hope you found that interesting. I enjoyed writing the book and researching it. It's a fascinating story about a range of warships, but also not just the mechanics of the warships, but also the officers and crew that made up the ship over all of those centuries. Thank you for your time.